is going to require 5 really fundamental shifts. Rethinking our ideas of agency, rethinking our relationship with the living world, rethinking our attitude towards time, rethinking human nature, and developing a whole new purpose for the economy.
So let's touch on that universal bottle as one of the innovations that Coca-Cola has taken as a next step. What do you see sort of coming out of that? What sort of impact? We know it's working in LATAM, but what will it need for us to move it into other geographies to be successful?
Well, it is already moving into other geographies. It's currently being rolled out in Africa, for instance, because it is a proposition that addresses the affordability concerns that consumers may have with reusable packaging, right? And at the same time, it's also, as a company, from an operational perspective, it has its advantages. It's a multi-serve PET bottle, refillable, that actually is standardized across multiple brands. What is changing is the label, Coca-Cola, Fanta, or Sprite, but it can be returned up to 25 times, right? And so in Brazil, this 2-liter multi-serve universal bottle has actually enabled us to avoid bringing 200 million single-use plastic bottles per year to the market. So there are very tangible environmental benefits, but it also addresses consumer concerns. And I think as we look at scaling up solutions, we will need to identify those sweet spots, where we do address consumer concerns related to convenience, to price, to taste, to quality, and keeping the consumer central as we develop new solutions is a key answer to the question, like, how do we scale up? Start with the consumer.
We'll start with some of the basics, and Michael, perhaps you could kick us off. How do you define regenerative design? Where do we start?
Well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge the people who have been working on it for quite a long period of time, the Regenerative group and Daniel Vahl, and of course, people like Janine Benyus. So for me, regenerative design is a lot more than just sustainability with all the knobs turned up. And in the book that I recently wrote with Sarah Ichioka, we argue that it's going to require 5 really fundamental shifts. Rethinking our ideas of agency, rethinking our relationship with the living world, rethinking our attitude towards time, rethinking human nature, and developing a whole new purpose for the economy.
Joanna, talk a little bit about what are the fundamental principles? How do we approach the idea of regenerative design that's different, perhaps, from how we thought about sustainable design in the past or other approaches to design?
Thank you, Tim. And just to say, it's really exciting and inspiring to be here. At the RSA for the last 3 years, we've been leading research on what it means to actually design in a regenerative way. That research was led by my colleague, Josie Warden, but working very closely with people across the RSA community, including Kate Rayworth, Daniel Christian Vahl, and others. And what we got to and what we published recently in May, the Design for Life mission, the new RSA mission, which focuses on our potential at the RSA to unlock social opportunity for social innovation that can help us transition towards a future that is more resilient, rebalanced, and regenerative. And in that mission, we capture some of the insights from our research around these sort of principles that you described, Tim. We refer to them as perspectives rather than principles, and there's a number of reasons for that. Firstly, because we believe that principles can be a bit too binary. It can feel like a checklist that you have to do all these things, and if you do them, you're getting it right. Whereas actually our understanding of regenerative design, as Kate Rayworth said earlier in the session, is very nascent. It's emergent, and we're continuously learning and developing ways of practicing in more regenerative ways. So perspectives leave more space for emergence and adaptability. So we can learn, and these can change over time. So we're not being sort of very explicit about these being the right ones. This is what we know for now, and these might change in the future. And the second reason is because perspectives recognize that we need different worldviews. We need to bring very different perspectives to the work that we have, and that fundamentally it's about the work that we do on the inside as individuals, as designers, engineers, change makers, before we start to act on the outside, the services that we're designing, the products, the systems, the policies. So the 6 perspectives that we suggest are firstly systemic, so understanding the system, recognizing that our systems are dependent and interconnected, and fundamentally that they're nested in the same way that our ecological systems are. And Kate Rayworth and the donut model represents that really well. So at the heart we have our economic system, and our economic system should be delivering value to our social and environmental system. There's no other value that is meaningful. Wealth for the sake of wealth, wealth that is not about creating human health and planetary health is not valuable. So making sure that our economy is working for society, and then making sure that social initiatives and social interventions are there to support environmental outcomes, because here as humans, as a society, we're here to care for the planet, for the wider ecologies. So that's the first principle. The second is adaptive, so learning from nature. There can never be a finite solution that is going to be the right idea or intervention for the long term, that we need to learn from nature and the adaptive cycle of nature. And for some of you who might be familiar with that sort of infinity model, that every intervention that we design goes through growth, through maturity, potentially collapse or death, but where it dies, it creates compost for the next idea to come. The third is around collective wisdom, and that's the wisdom of the diverse voices, and particularly those who are closest to the challenges or the kind of futures that we're seeking to create, but also looking at non-human wisdom, biomimicry, and what we can learn from nature. The fourth is imagination. We are the only human, the only animal on this planet with an innate capacity to imagine. And we can't solve today's problems with the same kind of thinking that created them, as Albert Einstein put it. So how are we tapping into our innate capacity to imagine, to create a radical future beyond the current paradigms? Fifth is long-term thinking, so moving away from the myopic views of our funding cycles, our policy cycles, profit and loss analysis, and really thinking about our stewardship for the long-term future. How are we acting today? What are we doing today that is leaving the planet in a better place for the generations to come, beyond our lifetime, beyond our jobs, our roles, how we exist within the organizations we're leading and working from? And finally, global, which is actually a term that Daniel Christian Wahl uses a lot, and it's the combination of global and local. And it's demystifying and fundamentally challenging this notion that there's a one-size-fits-all solution, that we just need to achieve sort of global scale of any sort of idea, that a good idea is scalable, and starting from place, from the context of that place, the strengths, the skills of the place, the soil, the climate of the place, and then working on interventions that work for that place and that come from the people and the resources of that place. And then learning can be spread, and that's how scale happens. So learning can be spread to other bioregions, other places, who may be inspired to try things in different ways. But yeah, change starts one place at a time, one bioregion at a time. So these are the kind of sort of perspectives we're now focusing on, because we believe that every person, every one of us is an agent of change. So if we all approach our future with these kind of perspectives front of mind, it can be absolutely transformational.
So as we move beyond agriculture, perhaps talk to us a little bit about what regenerative in architecture, what regenerative in the built environment means, and what opportunities it offers.
Yeah, sure. So painfully, I made an 11-year mistake in my career, which was thinking that exemplar projects would be a good way to bring about change. And after 11 years of working on those projects and being frequently told that these ideas are great, but the market's not ready for them, I decided that I had to collaborate with others to try and change the system. So I'm very much an advocate of Donella Meadows' thinking, and she argues that the best way to change the system is at the highest level of leverage points, changing the deep purposes of our organizations and changing the mindsets and worldviews that drive to a large extent how society behaves. And so the shift that's necessary is much more cultural than technological, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So the outcome of any particular technology is determined to a large extent by the mindset behind it. So take something like 3D printing. With the current dominant mindset, that could easily result in us drowning in tons of consumerist crap. If, on the other hand, we had a dominant regenerative mindset, 3D printing could be transformative, because it would allow us to use the right raw materials assemble them in ways that allow near perfect circularity, and to get much closer to the amazing resource efficiency of biological structures. And then the same applies to our cities. You know, to a large extent, a city is a reflection of how we see ourselves. And so if we're encouraged to think of ourselves as isolated individuals in a competitive zero-sum game, that leads to kind of suburban sprawl with lots of isolated buildings and frankly, a miserable quality of life. If, on the other hand, we take a more generous view of humanity as a species with a remarkable capacity for altruism and empathy and cooperation, it would lead to something more like the 15-minute city, with healthier food, cleaner air, better transport, cohesive communities, and a public luxury of shared facilities.
Another proposal that we recently made in March this year is about eco-design for sustainable products, where we precisely want to make sure that in the, let's say, coming decade, perhaps it will take a bit longer, we make sure that if a product is sold on the EU market, it is fully in compliance with the circularity principles. And if it's not necessarily welcome to the EU market. And maybe the second strand to mention is also the circular business models that we have heard quite a lot about today. We seriously also want to look into how we can really boost them to bring them from niche to mainstream, so on-demand production, repair, reuse services, products as service, and so on and so forth. Because here again, these create incentives for us to reduce our dependence on primary resources, decrease those pressures on biodiversity while still keeping, well, a good economic logic.
So VF in the regenerative space, it's not just about regenerative actually. So they have some science-based targets, but on top of that they looked at their 9 raw materials and realised actually it's one of the sort of biggest carbon emissions that we have within the supply chain. So we have 9 materials, and we realised that within the growing, the processing and the production, these were the ones that we needed to target. So within that, their goal is by 2030, those 9 materials will come from regenerative, renewable and recyclable. So from a brand point of view, so I work for Timberland, this is kind of a really easy target to look at because we start with materials. So I work with the design and development for apparel. And so from our point of view, we're looking at making sure that we have an equitable future, a greener future. It's inherent with Timberland about doing eco-innovation and sustainable products. So it's really important to us and has been for a long time. But now we're looking at really how we're leveraging that. So we're looking at it from a regenerative lens and also a circular lens. And so the two come together really to create that ecosystem.
Materium's a platform in the simplest explanation, but we often say that we're sort of not just a tech platform, although we do rely on tech quite a lot. We're more of a data commons and a community. So what we're aiming for is to kind of do a transformational shift in the way that materials are produced and used. Specifically now we're focused on plastics, really trying to transform that economy from a very centralized and linear one that's designed for petrochemical plastics to one that's highly distributed and really designed for renewable and abundant sources. We often say that we like to see the future of the plastics industry as similar to renewable energy, where it's based on renewables and it's highly adaptive to place rather than predicated on a kind of centralized global economy. And that's possible. Now we're seeing, success stories of biomaterials and regenerative materials in the hundreds. We'd like to see it in the thousands, maybe the tens of thousands, whatever we need to get the job done. And that's where Materium comes in. So we're providing the data commons and the open tools and the community to really support those early stage participants to scale and also to create far more diversity and participation in the regenerative materials economy than what you normally see today.
So Liz, I understand what you're saying is that the sort of mission of your organisation in some ways is to accelerate the transformation to renewable materials. Just pretend for a minute that I'm not very smart. What exactly, it might not be that hard for you, what exactly do you mean when you say tech? What is your tech doing?
Well, Sure. Okay. We'll do
In
this together. We'll go
35
on a journey.
seconds.
We'll go on a journey together. So we normally we're really leveraging two types of tech. One, open data, and two, artificial intelligence, specifically data mining and active learning. So one of the major issues right now is that data on regenerative materials is incredibly fragmented. It's largely academic. You can find it in hundreds of thousands of scientific papers, and they're all using discipline-specific jargon. Engineers, material scientists, I'm one of them, so I can say we're sort of the worst in terms of like accessible language. So one of the things that Materium does is we use data mining to collect the 100 to 500,000 unique material formulations for biomaterials, and we put that into one place, which is a data commons, completely open source and accessible to all, in a really user-friendly way and a searchable way. So all of a sudden, the world's knowledge of how to create high-performance biomaterials is at your fingertip. We then pair that with an active learning algorithm that can do the hard searching for you. So if you are a biomaterial developer and you're partnering with a consumer brand and you've come together and said, okay, these are our performance goals. It has to have this shore hardness or this compressive strength. And also here are our impact goals. It needs to have this amount of CO2 reduction, this type of organic content.
It's like an Ask Jeeves for
It
renewable
is
materials.
sort of like that. So if you input those performance goals, the active learning engine will actually identify high potential and promising formulations for you, which then as a team, you can go forward to rapidly synthesize, test, and ensure which direction you want to go forward with. So what we're basically trying to do is petrochemicals has about 100 years on us. They've been developing through trial and error and quite a lot of investment over the last 100 years to produce these really seemingly perfect performative materials. We're trying to put that 100 years in about 10, so that the material developers and the brands that we're seeing really trying to commit to more regenerative materials actually have the data, the tools, and the community they need at their fingertips to rapidly get to market much faster.
Biology is the native language of the environment. Cells manufacture things all the time without any human intervention. At Ginkgo, what we're doing is using synthetic biology, which is a technology, to produce organisms and molecules, again, using biology as the tool behind them. And we've talked today about regenerative materials all day. Ginkgo Bioworks is a platform using that the biological processes I mentioned to deliver regenerative ingredients. Ginkgo works as a platform, so you can think of us as an Amazon Web Services for synthetic biology. So when we talk to our customers, we know that becoming more circular is, of course, difficult, and these targets are difficult to reach. So we work with them and we understand what is it that we can do by leveraging biology to deliver the molecules that you need. So there's a few different ways. So of course, in some cases, companies are already using regenerative materials in their supply chains, but those materials are still derived from nature. They might be difficult to harvest. And while they're regenerative, they're still not as efficient as they'd like, in which case, of course, Ginkgo can support them. And then there's the cases where companies do have pain points in their supply chains, something that's keeping them from being circular, something that's keeping them from reaching another target. And again, we leverage the engineering of a cell to provide that exact molecule that they're looking for. And this is across industries, I think safe to say every industry that's included today. So of course, food and pharma, which we've heard examples of for years, but now cosmetics, materials, energy, you name it.
So synthetic biology is kind of like chemistry, right? There's something about the opportunity of it. It's presumably it's not ubiquitously good. How do you orientate that towards regenerative or circular principles? What do you need to do to ensure those positive outcomes are happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think by definition, this industry, synthetic biology, it's as circular as it gets. If you really want to look into the processes, we start out with ingredients as simple as yeast and sugar and a big fermentation tank, and you design for the product that you're looking for. So imagine creating an ingredient without the plant. This is already being done with many examples. Rose oil is one. Instead of an entire plant, you have just the ingredient. And then alternatively, you can look at animal-based products. So imagine if you could derive squalene without the whale. And again, this is already being done by the industry. So to me, that's as circular as it gets, and that's what really excites me about it.